Hello, everyone. Welcome to Octopus 101. Today we are talking multi-tenant deployments. I'm Ryan Rousseau, and I'll be the presenter for this webinar. Let's jump into the agenda. So today we're going to be covering some different multi-tenant application types and how the deployment pattern looks for those. And then we'll cover some multi-tenant deployment scenarios, such as deploying to shared or dedicated infrastructure, deploying alpha versions or beta versions before you deploy to your stable tenants, customizing your deployment process for a different category of tenants. And finally, we'll look at some other examples such as treating your team as tenants or treating like different regions or geographical locations as your tenants. And then we'll jump into a Q&A. One more thing I'd like to note before we get started, this is, even though it's an Octopus 101 webinar, this is really an introduction to multi-tenancy. So we're not going to be going through our normal getting started flow and setting everything up from scratch. So if you are new to Octopus, please go check out our getting started recording. I'll put a link to it in the notes below the video. And also, if you are interested, we run those pretty regularly. So check out our events page, which will also be linked. You can sign up for one of our upcoming getting started webinars where you'll learn a lot more about Octopus, the tool, and setting a project up and deployments up from scratch. But for today, we are going to be starting with existing projects and looking at one of the features called multi-tenancy. And what exactly are tenants? A tenant represents an isolated instance of your application in an environment. So say you have a production environment, you can have multiple instances of your application running in that production environment. And why would you want to do that? The most common use case is because you have different customers using your application and you want them to have their own isolated instance. So you have 3 customers, so you would have 3 instances of that application running in production. Now, another way to do this in Octopus without the multi-tenancy feature would be to, well, there may be a few different ways, but the more common way you would see people without using the multi-tenancy feature, they would set this up using environments. So they would have like a production-customer1 environment, a production-customer2 environment, production-customer3. So they end up with 3 production environments instead of just one that has isolated tenant applications running in it. So if you have that set up where you're setting up multiple environments, and it's not just production and not just for customers, if you're setting up multiple QA environments or you're setting up multiple environments for regions, you may want to look at the multi-tenancy feature. I'll be doing a deep dive into it today, how to set it up and configure it, and then what the deployments look like. So it'll give you an option. It'll give you an option if you want to consolidate some of those environments. And as I mentioned, even though customers are the most common use case, they can represent team members or testers or different pull requests or feature branches, geographical regions, data centers, and probably some more options that I haven't even thought of. So if you have a use case that doesn't fit into the categories I've listed here and you found that tenancy works for you, leave a comment and let us know what that use case is. All right, so this is a diagram of basically just illustrating that idea that I had earlier. We have an environment, let's say this is the production environment, and we've got 4 tenants running isolated instances of the application within this environment. So we'd have 1 environment instead of 4. So we have 1 environment and 4 tenants. Now let's look at a few different application types, multi-tenant application types in particular. So in this case, we have multiple customers that are logging into a single application, and that single application is connected to a single database. I've actually worked on a project like this. So usually what you do at the database level is you have either a tenant ID or a customer ID and in each of your tables where you need different data for your customers, or perhaps you split it up and you have a different schema per customer, and then each time they log in, you determine based on their user account which database schema or which schema in that database you're going to use to pull their data from. Now, one thing to note here is because it is a single application in a single database, we don't have an isolated instance per customer, which means if we do an upgrade, everybody's getting upgraded to the same version. Everybody's running on the same version, everybody's using the same database. So while the application is multi-tenant, the deployment pattern isn't necessarily multi-tenant because we're deploying all at the same time. The next pattern we'll look at is very similar, And it's really just a different way of isolating the data for the customers. So instead of using a foreign key or a different schema, we're using a different database entirely. So different customers log in to a single application based on their user account. We're pointing them at their customer appropriate database. And the deployment pattern is going to be the same. It's a single application. Everybody's on the same version. Everybody's getting upgraded at the same time. We may have some ad hoc processes that we run that updates maybe some custom, maybe they have some corrupted data, or we need to just add some data to their database for them or importing from another source. So you could have a ad hoc process to update one of these databases individually, but for the normal deployment of your application and upgrading the database to like a application standard, that's all happening at one time. So again, a multi-tenant application, but not necessarily a multi-tenant deployment. Now, the last case we're going to look at, which is the case we're going to focus on today, which is having a single application for each customer. So an isolated application for each customer. Customer one logs in, they're going to their own version of the application, which is connected to their own database. Customer two logs into their own application, which goes to their own database, and so on and so forth. Now you'll notice the difference here is because we have an application per customer. That means we can deploy different versions to different customers. Customer one can be on a long-term support edition that's, several months old. Customer two could be a beta customer and they're on the bleeding edge of what we have available for our customers to use. So we can update our customers without impacting other ones. All right, so this is the pattern we're going to work with for the most part today. So let's go ahead and look at our example application and take a look at the tenancy feature. So this is the application we're using today. It's a animal adoption site, so like an animal rescue site where you can go and find dogs and cats who need to be adopted, and maybe you're looking for a new pet to add to your household, so you're looking to rescue an animal. So this is our internal testing site. So we've got some configurable items here, like the main link back to the homepage, the name of the organization, which also shows up in the footer along with the version being run. And these sections up here are also configurable. So if we jump over, so this is our internal testing site. If we jump over to one of our customers, you can actually see the banner color is different. They've got their name in here. They don't have a cat section. This is only for dogs. So it's same application, same code being run, but it's different versions, even though they're running on the same version, they're isolated instances. They're not hitting the same application. All right, so this is the application we'll be working with today. Let's jump over to Octopus and look at the dashboard. So you can see I've got a number of projects set up. We're actually just going to skip the projects for now and come back to them a little bit later. We're going to go straight to tenants. So this is where you can configure your different tenants and you can add them, remove them, or just go in and update them, or just get a list of them. You can see that I've got several tenants that represent what I would call customers. So Big Dog Sanctuary, Chicago Cat Rescue, Dallas Animal Rescue. But then we have Derek Campbell. Derek is not a customer. He's on our team. He's one of our testers. So he wants to be able to push out maybe some code changes or database changes that he's working on, and he wants to push that out to a test environment just like we would push it out for a customer. So we've got Derek listed. We have our internal testing tenant. We've got a few regions that are going to be used for a different example. And then finally, we've got me. I am in here as well, and I am a tester on our team. All right, so let's look at one of these tenants. Let's open Big Dog Sanctuary. And in the overview of the tenant screen, you can see that it's connected to 3 projects. Now they all look the same because I'm doing multiple versions of the same project, but you could have just completely different projects here. Just because a tenant isn't associated with just one project or one type of project, they can be associated with any project. You'll also notice that for each project, it lists the environments that the project is related to or is associated with. So I can deploy this tenant to development, test, and production. Now that just happens to match my life cycle, and it doesn't have to. If I want to add a new project here, I can connect a project I can choose a project that it's not connected to yet, such as the QA project, and I can select the environments. Now the QA only goes to development and test, so I could just choose test here. And once I add this connection, we'll see that it has been connected and it's only tied to test. So it doesn't have to go to dev. Likewise, for any of these projects, I could remove dev and test and say this customer only has a production environment application. And that would probably be the most common case. Your customers, if you have customer tenants, they're more likely to only have a production environment. And again, it just depends on your process, but that's what I commonly see. Customers usually have a production environment. Sometimes they'll have a test environment, especially if they want those beta releases. They want to test new functionality before they pull it in. But it really depends on your deployment model and your relationship with your customers. So you may see customers that have dev and test, not development. You may see production only. I'm sorry, test and production, not development, and then production only. So that is the projects. That's where you can see the projects this tenant is connected to. On the right side of the screen, you can see tag sets. Now, tag sets, these tenant tags are similar to machine roles or target roles for your deployment targets. You can use these in a variety of ways, and we're going to look at a lot of the different ways throughout the demo. So you can use them for scoping variables. You can use them for assigning tenants to infrastructure, scoping different steps in your deployment process to a tenant tag, and then a few other things you can also do with them. But you could also not do any of those things. You could just have tenant type or tenant tags that are associated to a tenant just for informational purposes. So in this case, I've got customer here. This could be an information only. I think I will end up using it for an example in the demo, but you could just add tags that don't do anything other than give you some extra information about this tenant, a group of tenants. All right, so if you wanted to add tags, you would click the manage tags, and then you could go through all of the different ones that I have set up, and all of these are customizable. There's none built in. These are some that I set up commonly, like release rings. I want to have an alpha channel, a beta channel, and a stable channel for my deployments. So I know this is an alpha customer. Tenant types you probably wouldn't set up unless you do want to have a differentiator between customers and testers, but this is more for the demo today. You could also choose to have different features. So like if you have different levels of your application that you sell or different levels of your subscription that include different features, you can attach these feature tags to your tenant and say this tenant has a static IP, this tenant wants a deployment notification whenever a deployment goes out, etc. And the last one is hosting type. So is this tenant using shared infrastructure? Is it using dedicated infrastructure? Or are they hosting it themselves and I don't have access to their infrastructure and I need to use an offline drop? So those are the three hosting types I've set up for the demo. In this case, our Big Dog Sanctuary is an alpha customer. They have static IP and they have a deployment notification and shared. And even though I do have both of these in here, because even though most of these only have one value selected, as long as it makes sense, there's no reason that you couldn't add multiple to the tag selected. It just so happens that a lot of these cases, it only makes sense to pick one. So cancel that. So those are the tags that are selected. On the left side, you'll see that we've got an option to choose variables, which we'll look at last. Next, we'll just go into settings where you can upload a logo, you can change the name, and you can also enter a description. And the description shows up on this left side here, similar to how the description for a project works. Now, the description isn't tied to any of the projects. It's not really tied to anything. It's what you want to put in here. I happen to like this pattern of putting a header for the projects that I care about. It would probably be all the projects, but because I got some example projects, I'm not listing each one. They're all the same, just with different pieces added. So the final project of Forever Home Finder is here, and I've got links to their development site, which we looked at earlier, but also their test site, and then also their production site is listed here. Actually, I see that's wrong, so we can save that and actually fix their test site. Yeah, fix their test site, which has to load up. And it's got the old banner that doesn't have good contrast. So you can see that's a change that we've made throughout our deployments for them. They wanted the banner to look like their icon, the same color, but it turned out to not be great for a website. So we've pitched to them this nicer blue color, which is currently in our development environment. So right, so yeah, so anything that you put here, you can use Markdown, but this is nice to have a link to their different sites. You can also put in information. They're our first client, and they're our only alpha customer at the moment. So you probably have to keep that up to date. You may not want to put stuff in there that you have to change too often, but it's good to put some information in there so you know what is going on with this tenant. All right, let's look at variables. So we look at the variable screen, it's going to default us to the project variables, and project variables are variables that vary per project and per environment. So Forever Home Finder, because it is linked to development, test, and production, I will have a set of values to fill in for development, test, and production. So if I expand this out, you can see we've got database name, a site path, what port they're using, their navbar color, which I think that's wrong. Let's fill that in and keep aquamarine there. I previously had, let me copy this and reset that to the default just to explain. Right, so you can't have a variable, a tenant variable with an empty value. If you leave it blank and there's no default value, it will give you a warning that says you're not going to be able to deploy to this tenant. Everything has to have a value. If you leave it blank and save it, it's going to fill it back in with the default value. So this is a pattern I picked up somewhere along the way where you create a variable that has an empty value as a blank string, an empty string, and you use this variable if you want something to be empty, if empty means something. But in this case, I want it to be aquamarine. That was a nice color for our banner. And then we can choose whether it has a dog section and a cat section. And then we can set the same values, well, different values, but the same variables for development and test and production. All right, so let's save those. So this, again, is the project variables vary by project and environment. The next set of variables are the common variables. Common variables come from library variable sets. We'll take a look at that in just a second. You can see that we've got one variable set called tenant information. And these will show up whenever the variable set has some tenant variables associated with it and is included in a project that this tenant is attached to. Because this tenant is in the Forever Home Finder project and tenant information is included in that project, we have some common variables that we have to set. And unlike the project variables, the common variables don't vary. They are pretty much one value used everywhere, similar to like kind of how you use those library variable sets, right? So we're not going to set a different value per project. We're not setting a different value per environment. We're setting one contact name, one contact email, contract number, and key. And for the key, we do have a default that's just taking the name, lowercasing it, and replacing spaces with dashes. So we can use this in like our dynamic infrastructure, creating some databases and VMs, etc. But just because that's default, we can override it. We could put a different value in here. Don't have to use the default, but if you do have a default where you can make it dynamic, it is a good option to use, because then you won't have to change or fill in as many variables as you start adding tenants. So yes, common variables don't vary. Project variables vary by projects and environment. And the common variables are good for things that are static about the tenant. So contact information, your contract number, email information, things like that, things that you want to be the same everywhere. Maybe an API key that you have for them that works across a suite of tools. That one, an API key would probably end up as a project variable, but it depends. Maybe you've got one API key for Slack for them and it's the same everywhere. All right, so that's the variables, and that is everything on the tenant screen. Let's move on from the tenants and let's quickly jump into the library and we'll look at the tenant tag set screen. So this is where you define those tag sets. So if you want to set those up, you would come here, you would click on add tag set, you would choose a name, like something like my tag set, or specifically put in what purpose these serve. You can give a description, and then we would start adding tags. So we'd have tag 1, give it a color, we'll use red. Tag 2 will be blue, and we'll add those two. And then once we save this, we'll have a new tag set with tags 1 and tag 2 that we could go and we could apply this to any of our tenants, and we could start using it in the various places where tag sets are accepted. So place where you can come in, you can also edit and remove tags or add tags. If you do remove a tag, you're going to get a warning that says if it's in use anywhere. Yeah, so if we go in, I think we can show that. So we delete this, yes, it will actually fail. If this tag's being used anywhere, it will fail. All right, so that's tag sets. Discard those changes. We've got our different tag sets that we've already explained earlier. Let's go over to the variable sets. All right, so variable sets, we've got our tenant information that we saw earlier on the tenant screen. If we open this up, you'll find my empty value variable that has no value. I use that as a placeholder for empty strings. For variable common variables for the tenant, those are under variable templates. So if we open variable templates, we'll see contact name, contact email, the contract number, and the key. So all the variables I've set up, if we open one of these, you'll actually see more information. So let's open contact name, and you'll see with the variable name, we have decided to give it tenant.common.contact name. Now, if you've seen any of my other webinars or any of the Ask Octopus videos, you know that I really like having a naming convention that has kind of like a hierarchy. So like this is a tenant variable, it's a common variable, it's the contact name. So it kind of also maps to the Octopus built-in variables to kind of map the same way. So you have octopus.environment.name. So it's an Octopus variable related to environments, and it's the name of the environment. So in this case, common may not have been the best choice. I mean, there's no right or wrong choice. It's whatever works for you. But this could have also been tenant.contact.name to follow more of the Octopus style of naming conventions. I do like having common here because it lets me know immediately, like, oh, that's a common variable. I need to go find where it's defined in a variable set as opposed to a project. So we give it a variable name that we're going to be able to use and reference this in our scripts and our steps. We give it a label, contact name. We choose its variable type. This is a single line text box, but it could be a checkbox. It could be a Azure account or a certificate if you want to have those vary or be variables for your tenants. And we can add a default value if we want to. Again, if you have a default value that is dynamic, that uses some of those built-in Octopus variables or some other variables that you've already created, that would go a long way of saving you some configuration for each of those variables. If it's something that you want to make sure that always has, it's like an important variable, and there's not a default that would always work, you want to probably err on the side of caution and leave it blank to force you to put in that right value every time. All right, so we're going to cancel. We don't need to update that. And that is the variable set. You do notice that with the key, it does show me what the default value is in line. I don't have to open and scroll down to see what my default value is. So that's a nice addition there. And that is variable sets. So under the library, we've hit tenant tag sets and variable sets. Let's move on to infrastructure. By looking at the infrastructure, we're going to answer a pretty important question. How does Octopus know if I'm deploying multiple tenants, multiple customers to the same environment? I've got multiple customers going to production. When I deploy my release to production for Big Dog Sanctuary, how does it know what deployment targets to use? And we're going to answer that by looking at the deployment targets. And you can probably already see the answer on the screen, but I'm just going to kind of go in order here. So we've got this single VM. This is a single tenanted VM. It matches what you're familiar with. It's attached to an environment and a role, and that's it. When I deploy a single tenant project to development, any steps that use this role will use this target. If we look at the one right below it, we'll see the contrast. This one is a production target, the same role as before, but it also has a tenant associated with it. It has Dallas Animal Rescue associated with it. So when I deploy to production for Dallas Animal Rescue, it's going to use this tenant, this target. It's not going to use any of the other ones. If we open this up, we can see where to set that. It is towards the bottom under restrictions. You can decide whether it's excluded from tenant deployments, only used in tenant deployments, or both. So maybe you have a target that is shared between tenanted projects that are non-tenanted, or you have a mixed tenancy project where it's doing untenanted and tenant deployments, you would choose this option. But if this target is only used for tenants, you would choose the middle option, only include in tenant deployments. Once you've selected either this option or the last one, you can then associate the tenants with this target. And you can have multiple. So if this was not a dedicated target, you could throw multiple tenants onto the list, in which case, when you deploy to any of these, it would use this target. There's a better way of assigning multiple targets to, multiple tenants to a target. And we'll look at that right now, which is by using the tenant tag. So this is the first place where tenant tags are really coming into play outside of being tagged to the tenant on the tenant screen. Let's open up this shared VM. So this is a shared VM. Any tenants tagged with shared are going to use this. So if I deploy to internal, if I deploy to Big Dog Sanctuary, or any of the other ones with the shared tag, they will use this target. And you simply set that up by, instead of choosing each of those individually, you choose the tag. What's nice about this is if you are continuing to grow, you're continuing to sell your product, and you're getting more customers on, and they're going into the shared versus the dedicated model, you don't have to come to all of your shared targets and add new customers to the list every time you add a customer. Once you add a new customer, a new tenant, and you mark it as shared, it will automatically be associated with this target by virtue of the tag. Another nice thing to check out, because I overlook this a lot, I don't know, I just don't notice it a lot, but it's here, and it is noticeable. It's just me, for some reason, I don't see it. But this tenant preview screen will bring up a dialog that has that same set of selectors. So you can choose the tenants by name, you can choose by tag, but what you see at the bottom is you get a list of all the ones that match. And you could also unselect this checkbox to see all the other ones that don't match, and then you can compare, like, well, why doesn't Chicago Cat Rescue match? It should be in shared. So maybe you've left the tag off somewhere, you can go and fix that problem. But it is nice that it'll actually tell you these are the 4 at this time that match this tag or this combination that you have set up here. So these are the 4 tenants that will use this target. So nice feature there. Tenant preview, use it if you want to build out some rules using your tags. All right. Deployment targets. And if I have an offline drop that is like the shared VM is tag shared, I have an offline drop that is tagged as offline. So any customers that don't want to give us access to their infrastructure, we can use an offline drop, and then we can create that offline drop and send it to them and let them run the deployment. Okay, so that is the deployment targets. That's how you tell Octopus when you're deploying to a tenant in a certain environment, which targets to use. Let's get to the dashboard and let's look at these projects. We've got a couple of different steps here. So we're going to walk through just kind of a evolution from a single tenant application to an application that supports untenanted and tenanted deployments, to finally our main application and its main use case. And then we'll have some final examples where we look at like QA and multi-region tenants versus customers. Okay, so let's start with the single tenant application. And we're not going to spend a lot of time here because really this is just to illustrate the differences between single tenant deployments and multi-tenant deployments in Octopus. So, and I guess the path here would be, we created this application once. We didn't know it was going to be multi-tenant. We sold it. We created it for a customer, maybe on a contract. And then we had the ability to resell it afterwards. So we decided after the fact that it was successful, this would be good to make into a product. So we want to convert this single tenant application into multi-tenancy. And we're going to start by looking at the differences. So the main differences are on the overview screen, the process, and the variables. So we'll start on the overview screen. And you'll see, just like most projects you're used to, we've got the releases listed down the side and across which environments they've been deployed to, what version, and what time. So this is the view for the single tenant application. We go to a process. We have a simple, not a simple process, but we've got a short number of steps. So we're creating infrastructure and including dynamic infrastructure through a health check. We're deploying our web application, and then we are writing the URL to that new web application in the logs so that we can have an easy access to it. I do want to highlight this because it is one of my favorite things to do in deployment processes. And I said highlight, it's actually called highlight. If you use write highlight, anything you put in this will show up in the deployment process, not the process, but the logs at the top level screen. And I think because it doesn't have a URL, oh, there it goes. It does have a URL. Yes. So under any task or step that has the right highlight, you'll get a blue highlighted like line of text. So anything you put there will show up at the top level instead of needing to click into the step and find that specific log. It's really good for bringing like important log messages up to the task summary. But I like to use it because it does support some of the some Markdown. It doesn't support all Markdown, but some Markdown. It does support links, so we can get a link to our customer and click that and open their website. Sorry about that. That was a little digression there, but I really like the right highlight command that we have in our deployment task. So if that's something you haven't seen before, don't abuse it. Don't pull all of your logs forward into the summary, but you can use it for some important test logs or to have some URLs listed there. Okay, so we're, like I said, creating our infrastructure, pulling it in, deploying, writing our URL. There's nothing tenant specific in this deployment process. Lastly, let's look at the variables, and we've got our variables that you would expect in a project. We have some app settings because we are using app settings.json. We're going to insert these values into our configuration file. We've got some project values that are used throughout the deployment process. And then we've got some Terraform variables that we're using to create our infrastructure, along with some passwords that have been marked sensitive. All right, so that is the main thing. So the variables are different, the process is different, and the overview will be different. So let's go, before we go look at the differences, if you wanted to take a single tenant application and convert it to multi-tenancy within Octopus, the first step you would do is go to settings. You would scroll down to multi-tenant deployment option under deployment settings, and you would choose either allow deployments with or without a tenant. So this is kind of a mixed mode. You have untenanted deployments, which are basically what you have in this project now. And then you would have tenanted deployments alongside of it. Or if you're going to skip that step completely, you're setting a project and you want to have tenants only, you would choose the third option, require a tenant for all deployments. In this case, we would choose this, but I am not going to save that. Instead, we're going to go look at the next step, which is this application that's already been converted into mixed tenancy mode. All right, so you should see that we don't have releases listed down the side anymore. Instead, we have our tenanted, we have our tenants, and we have a untenanted lane. So the untenanted lane really represents that process that we were looking at in the previous project, that single tenant deployment process. It's not using any tenant variables. It's not using any tenant tags. It's just the deployment process we had before. And we can see that it's been, what versions are in dev, test, and production. And then we have our internal tenant and our big dog sanctuary tenant, and they've both gone to development, but they haven't gone any further. And you may notice usually you would have a deploy button here. Because we're not looking at the releases on the side, it's not assumed that you want to promote this release up to this environment. And you get this message that you need to filter the dashboard by releases to perform a deployment. You do that by coming to filter release number and then choosing a release at that point. So if I wanted to choose this release, I then get the option to deploy it. So one more thing I like to mention before moving on to the process is untenanted and internal. And what are the differences? And really, in my examples, internal is meant to replace the untenanted deployment. This is a pattern that I'm not entirely sure. I don't remember where I first saw it, but I really like it. And it's meant to be a tenant that represents our internal testing and development, maybe even production infrastructure, but at least development and test infrastructure, so that it replaces the untenanted version. And that's not something you have to do. I'm not pushing this as a best practice. I'm just mentioning this as maybe an option that you, after I explain why I do this, you may see that that's the way you want to go as well. You may also say, nah, we'll stick with untenanted. That's perfectly fine. The reason why I set up a internal tenant that matches our internal dev and test production, or dev and test deployments, is because the untenanted, as I mentioned, doesn't use the tenant variables. It doesn't use the tag sets. So by setting up an internal variable or internal tenant, I can configure tenant variables for it. I can assign tags to it. And then I get a little more confidence, in my opinion, on the deployment process. When I'm deploying to a tenant, like a customer tenant, I'll know that I've already tested that the variable names, the tenant variable names in use, I haven't misspelled them anywhere. If there's any tag sets in common, I know that it's going to run certain steps or not run certain steps. So that's why I like setting this up internal versus a untenanted one. No right approach, but those are the options you have. Okay, so those are the differences on the screen. Let's go to the process, and we'll see that we've got some tags. So this is the second place we've seen the tenant tags coming in to modify something about the deployment. In this case, we're saying, you know what, our shared tenants, they already have infrastructure created. We've already created the shared infrastructure. We don't need to run create VM or health check for those. So we've tagged these two steps with the dedicated tenant tag. So if I'm deploying to a dedicated tenant, it will create a VM if it doesn't exist, and it will run the health check to pull that new infrastructure into the deployment. Likewise, at the bottom, we have a new step that is deploying. After the deployment, it's going to send an email to the customer. And not everybody wants this. So it is a feature tag. So if they have the feature tag of deployment notification, we will run this step for those tenants. And it's going to, you can see it sending an email to one of those common variables that we've set up. So those are the differences on the deployment process. And lastly, let's look at the variable screen. So we've got, it will look pretty similar, but you'll see that we are using some built-in Octopus variables for the tenants. So the site name now is the tenant name. So whatever the tenant name is, we'll use that as the site name. We've got some tenant.site.path variables being used, or database name to configure which database is being used in the connection string. And if we scroll down further, you will see that we're using tag sets again here to have different site URLs. So dedicated tenants have one format, shared tenants have a different format. Now, if you worked with the scoping for variables for, you're probably wondering how I set these values. If you go into a variable to define the scope, you get the default options of selecting an environment, some target roles, some targets, the deployment steps, or a channel. Where are the tenant tags? Well, if you click on Open Editor, you'll get a dialog that has the name and the value, and then the default options, but you can also choose tag sets from here. So it'll load the tag sets available, and you can go in and say, this is the format or the value I want to use for my alpha customers or my, offline customers. All right, so let's cancel that. So that's one way to get that screen. You can also get to it if you open the editor from this side. So say you're setting the name or you're setting it as a prompted variable, or you just want to use the larger text area from this screen. If you hit define scope, it'll take you to that dialog. And from here, you can also preview the tenants like you can on the infrastructure screen. So another place where that tenant preview has come in handy. All right, so and these are just the project variables where we can use tag sets to scope by. Now you'll note you can't scope to an individual tenant at this place in the variables or in the process at the project level. It doesn't really know about the individual tenants. It knows about the tags. So you can't come in and say this tenant uses this value specifically. That's where the project variables come into play, and those are set up in the project templates. So we can see those that we have: tenant.database.name, site.path, site.port, and whether it has the doc section or not. And this screen looks very similar to what we had under the variable sets under the library for the common templates. And if we open one of these, it's the same dialog. So we give it a name, so tenant, the area, and the variable. Label, choose its control type and its default value. So this is the screen where you configure the variables that you will set up on the project variables section of the tenant. You can also look at the common templates. So you can't change them here, but you can look at them. If you've included a library set that has common templates, you can see them listed here. And finally, on the variables, before we move on, I do want to show this preview tool. Comes in handy when debugging, like what variables are being used, especially tenant variables, especially if you are converting a project from single tenancy to multi-tenancy. You can come in and choose a environment, you can choose a tenant, you can choose steps and roles if you need to, but I've been using these two options mainly, like what does it look like for tests in my internal tenant. And then you can see it's going to pull in as many things as it can evaluate. Obviously, we can't evaluate the release number because we're not in the context of a release, but it will show you the site path and the site name and other, as long as it's not a sensitive variable, it'll show you the value being used for that tenant. We switch back, you'll see some of these change. Some of those change to the tenant specific value. The last thing we want to look at before we move on to the full project is a deployment option. So after we create a release and we try to deploy it, there's a new section called Tenants, and it defaults to untenanted. So this is going down that single tenant deployment path. Once you choose tenanted, you're going to be required to choose which tenant or which multiple you can be one or many tenants to deploy to, or you can choose by tenant tag again. So if you wanted to deploy to all of your shared tenants at once, you don't have to individually go in and select them. It's only 2 here, so it's not a big deal. But if you had 10, 20 tenants and you want to deploy to all of your shared tenants at once, you can use that by the tag. And there is a tenant preview option here too, so you can see who's going to be deployed to. Under advanced, you also have just the option to include all tenants. We only have 2 connected for this environment, but if you had a lot, you could choose to connect 2 tenants. And there are reasons you may not want to include all tenants in a deployment all at once, and we're going to talk about that at the next project. So there's really nothing new to show on this screen other than we've got more tenants. We don't have the untenanted option anymore. Our process is pretty much the same. Our variables are pretty much the same. We're going to go in and create a release and click that deploy button here. And I want to show why you may not want to deploy to all of your tenants all at once. And it really depends on the number and your Octopus server hardware itself and your setup. If you're in HA, that may give you some more leeway. But if we deploy to development, let's just go ahead and just deploy to both of them. All right. So normally when you click the deploy button, it takes you to the task log for the deployment it created. But in this case, it's taking us to a list of tasks. Why did it do that? Because each tenant deployment is separate. They're isolated, and that's what we want. So it didn't create one deployment, it created two deployments. And I can open either of these to see the task summary at that point. So that is probably why be careful about clicking that deploy to all tenants button, because if you have say 30 tenants, but your task cap is only set to 5 or 10, it's going to queue 20 to 25 deployments, and then those are going to have to wait until the other ones finish, and your queue is going to start to build up. Now that may not be a problem for you, but it is something to consider. If you've got a larger task cap, if you've got a high availability setup with multiple nodes, and you're fine running all of those deployments at once, then that's great. But it is something to consider if you're on a single Octopus node and you have a lower task cap. You could run into a lot of queuing if you try to deploy all at once. All right, so while that's running, see we get our nice link from Right Highlight. It's going to send me an email letting me know, well, yes, for this one, they do have that feature. So it is going to send me that email. Oh, yes, obviously, or else it wouldn't show up here. That is something we could show as part of the deployment. Pretty sure they don't have that feature. Oh, they do have that feature. We'd have to run it for someone who doesn't. Okay, well, we can do that as well. So that is how you would run the deployments for the multi-tenant option. And since we've created that release, we can also come in and look at it here and see we can't deploy to test for either Chicago Cat Rescue or Dallas Animal Rescue. One of these is production only, and one of these has a test environment, which I think it is, yeah, it's Dallas Animal Rescue, because it still has to go to dev first. It still has to have a successful development deployment before you can go to test, even though DAR is not associated with the development environment or linked to the development environment. You can't skip it and go straight to test. But now that it has been deployed, we can deploy to test. Now, since we have selected this release, we can deploy each of these individually. We can go back to the release screen and choose the tenants we want to deploy to, or we can deploy to all of them directly from the overview, which will take us to the screen with these pre-selected. So we can do that. And if we choose the one for Dallas Animal Rescue, we should see, unless I've given it the same feature, we should see that it does not have the deployment notification step. Right. So it's only going to, and it's a dedicated tenant. So it's got extra steps. So the two we looked at prior didn't have steps 2 or 3. This one has steps 2 and 3, but it does not have step 5. So we have one process defined, used across multiple tenants and multiple environments. But you can customize it based on the needs you have for your tenants or deploying to your tenants. All right, I think that is it for this overview. Let's jump down and look at some other examples. The first thing we'll look at is the multi-region one. So this one, we're not talking about customers only. We do have our internal testing tenant that I do like to set up. But once we get to production, let's say production is split between 2 or more Azure regions. It's in Central US and Western Europe, or any other cloud region. What you may see and what you may have set up is a production dash Central US, and then immediately after that, like a production dash West Europe, and then other production environments. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you've only got a few, that's fine. It's probably not cluttering up your dashboard too much. It's probably not that hard to manage, especially in something that's probably finite, like cloud regions. If you were using customers, that means every time you added a customer, you'd have to add a new environment, update your lifecycle, probably update some channels. But for cloud regions, you probably don't have that much changing to do. You're probably not adding those very often. But this is an alternative setup, and I like this approach. So maybe it's something you'd be interested in. So that's why I'm sharing this way of doing it. Yeah, so once you have deployed to test, you can then deploy to Central US production, and then West Europe production. So maybe you want to deploy to one as a canary, and then once it's good, you can deploy it to the other region. So this is one pattern that you can set up. Let's go back and look at some other projects that's still running. Let's look at the QA project. All right, so I've got my Forever Home Finder project. I cloned it and listed it as a QA project. So this is a test version of that project where my testers can go in and deploy their versions. You may want to do this. You may want to keep them separate. The downside to that is you clone everything. So you have to keep the process updated in two places, variables updated in two places, etc. You do get the benefit of having them separate, so you won't accidentally deploy the wrong version to your tenant, or a test version to your tenant. You won't accidentally deploy one of these to production, which there's multiple ways to limit that. So I would actually say, unless you have like very, very strong reasons to not combine them, I would actually combine these tenants, these QA tenants and the customer tenants into one project. And that's what I've done in the full example. So in the full example, we've got our customer tenants and we have our QA tenants. And at first glance, you're like, I probably don't like this because they're mixed together. I've got QA in the middle of a bunch of my customer tenants. It's still showing production, even though it's got the no sign on it. If I accidentally set this this tenant up wrong, that could set things up. I could accidentally deploy a QA release to production, but I'm going to talk about how you can solve some of those problems, which is we can use this group by, which we haven't looked at yet. You can group by things like your different release rings, which is really handy to come in and say, hey, let me look at all my alpha customers and let me deploy this release to all of my alpha customers, or likewise deploy to all of your shared customers or dedicated customers. So I really like this grouping feature. I use it mostly, I think, for the alpha beta. That's a good use case. But when you do have testers mixed in with your customers, that's where this tenant type could come in handy. So you could have your customers listed separately from your testers. The other thing you want to do is, even though these are not linked together, if you want to make sure that your tester tenants like don't have access to deploy to production and are separate from these customer tenants, we can do that with channels, because that is the last place you can go in, and I've already got them set up. So you can go in and say that my default channel is using my default lifecycle, limit it to the customer tenants, and my test channel is only for testers. So if we go in and create a release, and let's say I want to create a test release, if I go to deploy this release, it should limit me, and I should not be able to deploy it to anyone. And it's actually going to auto select the tester tag for me, but I don't want to auto select. Maybe I just want to choose one or two. It's only going to let me go to the tester. So this is how you can have releases that you limit their ability to go to different tenant types. So if that's a concern you have, I would, you can also group by the channel, which is kind of nice. But if you want to combine your QA tenants and your customer tenants, and that's a concern you have, set up a tenant type so that you can separate them, set up some channels so that their releases can't go to the wrong tenant type. And that should solve most of the concerns there. If you still have concerns after those are set up a separate project just for your testers, and go from there. Okay, I believe that is the end of the demo. We've covered a lot. We've looked at the entire tenant configuration, how you configure all the pieces and where all of those pieces are used. And we've looked at several patterns with the deployments. Let's look at some Q&A and answer some questions. So the first question is, can we use variables in the custom URL links you had on the left? And I believe that is referencing yes. So the answer, I believe, is no, because the variables are used in the context of a deployment, and this is not a deployment. These are just a description where listed, so now you cannot use variables here. Next question is, when would you recommend to use spaces instead of tenant tag sets? Tenant tag sets for separating tenants out. Well, if you use spaces, spaces are hard walls, and we haven't really mentioned that on here, but we do have multiple spaces. These are really for separating your teams out, or different product suites, or teams or product suites, or you could even separate out like environments like dev and test and production through this. There's a lot of, like most of the Octopus features, there's a lot of use cases for those. But if you put tenants in different spaces, you have to create everything. There's nothing shared between spaces. So you'll have to create those projects over again, create those environments over again. So yeah, you have a lot of duplication there. If that's something you need, if there's a reason you need tenants to have all of their own different spaces, then you may not even need the tenant feature. It depends on how many tenants you're going to put into a space. If you're putting like multiple tenants into a space, then yeah, you would still use the tenancy feature. But if you're putting one tenant per space, you would probably just do a project without the tenancy in the tenant specific space, if that makes sense. Next question is, what if you need project variables that are different per environment, but you want to share them across projects? Okay, so we have our project variables that we want to, basically we want to share these across these three projects. Yes, that's not something supported through the tenant variables today. I have a knowledge base article at help.octopus.com that shows how you can kind of use a workaround combining the common variables and the project variables to achieve that. I will link to that in the follow-up email that goes out, and I'll link to that in the video notes once we upload it. All right. No, that's a good question. That question comes up a lot. Are tenant tag sets the only way to let Octopus determine the appropriate deployment target for a tenanted release? No, they are not. There's two ways of doing it, and that is using the tenant tag set or tagging the tenant directly. Those are the two ways of letting Octopus know which target to use. All right. Can we automate projects being attached to certain tenants, possibly based on tags? So I guess this is asking whether if I create a new tenant, can I have it automatically associated with some projects automatically? Maybe based on tags. So like if I gave it a tag, would it assign to a project automatically? That's an interesting idea. No, there's not a way of doing that right now, but what you can do is set up maybe a template tenant, and I'm just going to use internal as an example, even though it wouldn't really be my template. But you also have the option under settings to clone the tenant. So if you wanted to say that, we'll just call this my new tenant. And once you save it, it's going to clone the internal tenant, and it's going to have everything cloned. So it's got the same tag sets, it's got the same project association, it's got the same, it's the same variables, because that was the default variable. Yeah, so it's got the same variables and everything. So you can set up I definitely would not clone an existing one. I would probably set up a template. I would set up a tenant that's only used to be the one that I clone other tenants from. So that is an option. That's a relatively new addition to the tenant screen, the clone option. So that's a good question. Can you create a tenant and populate variable values via an API? Yes. So Octopus has built API first. Everything you can do through the UI, you can do through the API. We've got some documentation, which I'll put in the follow-up email. You can also open up DevTools and the network traffic. So if you're on any specific page and you want to see which endpoints it's hitting, what data it's sending, that's an easy way to do it. There's also, if you want an example, if we pull up let's use one of these. If we pull up library.octopus octopus.com. This is our community step template library. Before the clone tenant feature was enabled, there's clone and there's also create. I wrote two, well, create's going to have a lot of options. I wrote two community step templates for cloning a tenant and creating a tenant. So this would be a good example. Close. This would be a good example if you want to see how to use the API to create a tenant. And I'll include a link to this as well in the notes. Okay, lots of good questions. So one more, what would a appropriate way to set up deployment target, which would need to deploy to multiple tenant environments? Okay, if I am understanding correctly, because you can have a target that's in multiple environments, what's the appropriate way to set it up to have a tenanted target in multiple environments? And it's the same method. You add it to multiple environments. So if we say, for example, our development, maybe we use development and test. The shared is the same VM and they're just using different ports and different URLs, which would probably be a good way to set this up. You can come in and say development and test and save that. And now if you're deploying to dev or test for any of the shared tenants, it will use this target. And you'll still have the variables that are scoped per environment. So that doesn't affect your deployment, like the deployments. It'll use the right variables because Octopus will know I'm deploying to test in this instance. It's just pulling in the target that's shared between them. So that is how you would do that. All right. Thanks everybody for the questions. Those are great questions. I really like those. Okay, let's just start up the presentation and go to the outro. So we've got some resources here. So we've got a link to the deployment pad, our documentation for multi-tenant deployments. Our YouTube channel has a lot of videos, including this video that will be uploaded to it and previous webinars. You can go to octopus.com/trial to start a cloud or server trial. And there is a free starter edition for Octopus Server. So there are some limitations. It has 10 targets. There are some other limitations you'd want to read about, but it is free and you can use it to get started with Octopus. And finally, we've got octopus.com/events, a new page where you can find out about the webinars that we are doing, any conferences or user groups that you can find some Octopus people at to talk to. And with that, thanks everybody for joining. Thanks for watching. Thanks for the questions. We have upcoming webinars, November 13th, turbocharging Team City. And November 20th, we are doing our next Getting Started webinar. So if you're looking for one of those Getting Started webinars, they are coming up soon. All right. Thanks again, everyone, and we will see you next time.